My name is Amy Elkins. I grew up in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and went to a small liberal arts college there, Hendrix College. From there, I moved to Charlottesville, Virginia, and did a master's degree in English at the University of Virginia, and continued my travels from there to Atlanta, Georgia, where I did a PhD in English at Emory University. And that's where my research interest really picked up a lot of momentum. So my background is definitely rooted in literary studies and English, but I've been really surprised at how capacious English is as a discipline, and how craft studies has really filtered in to my work in literary studies. HD, or Hilda Doolittle, was her full name. She is such an endlessly fascinating person to me. She was born at the end of the 19th century and lived a really exciting life in a lot of ways. Some interesting things about her are that she was part of, or the center of, a movement in poetry called Imagism. And basically, Imagism was a poetic movement, kind of a philosophy, I guess is a better way to explain it at first, where a lot of male poets like Ezra Pound and Wyndham Lewis, big names, they were getting together and trying to understand what poetry could do, how poetry communicated, and they were very interested in distilling the poetic line to really essential images. And they were very curious about how could a distilled image, or what you might call a simple image, open up entire worlds of meaning. So making those very dense and loaded but terse poems. HD came on the scene and was really the first poet to actually write Imagist poems, and this was kind of revolutionary in a certain sense because she wasn't a well-known poet. She wasn't someone who was at the center of movements like this, and so that label, the Imagist poet, really stuck with her. So her first publication was signed HD Imagiste, and that's how HD became associated with that and really gave rise to it. She had a very mystical imagination. She was really curious about how language exists in an otherworldly realm almost. At the same time, she had a very material sense of the world. So that definitely informs my research in a lot of ways. How do those two things come together? The research really began, as with all of my kind of sub-projects, I guess, under the umbrella of the larger project, with a real intense desire to actually study artifacts themselves, to not just think about the metaphorical. Working with her family to locate these, this entire archive, really a whole collection of artifacts, and then to encounter them in a certain way, it felt like bringing HD back from the dead in a certain way, which is something, because of her mysticism, I know she would have enjoyed. But to really think and encounter how crafters live in the objects that they make, that is very profound as a researcher, to not just study a primary document, but to really be a part of excavating it. I've always had an interest in craft. My earliest memories are about making things, about sort of being in the natural world and kind of absorbing nature through putting things together, building things, or tying daisy chains, or things like that. But even as I started to read books, I had an intense fascination with Helen Keller and Annie Sullivan. And I remember, for me, it was the tactile dimension of their communication, the actual signing into each other's palms. That struck me as very poetic in a certain way. It was about communication, and it was about making the world visible. And that was very important to my development intellectually, but it's also a kind of tactile way of communicating. So from there, I started to learn more about my own family's history, and there was definitely a kind of mythology around my great-grandmothers, and the artifacts that I had to attest to that mythology, if you will, were quilts. And I remember studying the way that the fabric was joined together at the seams and really thinking about you know, color and sort of, well, this part is dark and this is light, and how that creates sort of negative spaces. And I was really fascinated by that. Those women were Native American, although they passed as white to stay in Arkansas when Indigenous people were being pushed out. So as I developed a political awareness of how craft objects can tell stories, really, that go in a lot of different important directions, I was really compelled by that. So by college, I decided to minor in darkroom photography, and that kind of brought making really to the fore. And I loved working with alternative processes and manipulating negatives and just different things like that. Just hearing others talk about craft can be really invigorating and energizing for my research. So the American Craft Council had been on my radar, as had the Twin Cities, as a kind of mecca of craft people. And I love the library. I think the archives are a tremendous resource, and most importantly, the people that I've met and the conversations that I've been able to have been really enriching for my work.